At dawn on June 22nd, 1941, the skies above the Soviet frontier roared with the thunder of more than 3,000 German aircraft, while nearly 4 million Axis soldiers surged forward across an 1,800-mile front. It was the largest invasion in human history, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, Adolf Hitler's gamble to conquer the Soviet Union in a lightning war. What Hitler believed would be a swift victory instead unleashed a titanic struggle of unimaginable scale and brutality, a war of annihilation that would ultimately seal the fate of the Third Reich. The Second World War, erupting in September 1939 with Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland, quickly engulfed much of Europe and beyond. Within 2 years, Adolf Hitler's armies had achieved stunning victories, overrunning Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and France, while driving Britain to the edge of collapse. By 1941, Nazi Germany appeared militarily unstoppable, its war machine reinforced by the resources of conquered territories and an alliance with fascist Italy and Imperial Japan. Yet behind this outward dominance lay deeper ideological ambitions that stretched beyond the mere conquest of Europe. At the heart of Hitler's worldview was a vision of a racial empire founded on conquest, extermination, and colonization. This vision, rooted in notions of Lebensraum, living space, anti-communism, and racial war, would lead directly to the most audacious and catastrophic military campaign. Hitler's ideological goals had been clearly set out in Mein Kampf during the 1920s and consistently reiterated in speeches and policies throughout the 1930s. The central pillar was the pursuit of Lebensraum in the East. According to Nazi doctrine, Germany's survival and future greatness depended on acquiring vast territories for settlement and agricultural production. These lands, Hitler argued, would be seized from the Slavic peoples, whom he regarded as racially inferior, and transformed into a Germanic empire. Intertwined with this goal was Hitler's uncompromising hostility to communism, which he conflated with Jewish Bolshevism. For him, the Soviet Union was not merely a political rival, but the embodiment of a racial and ideological enemy that had to be destroyed. The war in the East, therefore, was conceived not as a conventional military struggle, but as a racial war of annihilation aimed at eradicating entire populations and reshaping the continent's demographic order. By 1940, with Western Europe largely subdued and Britain standing isolated, Hitler turned his attention eastward. Though some of his generals urged caution, warning against a two-front war, Hitler believed that defeating the Soviet Union would be swift and decisive. Several factors drove this decision. First, Germany's reliance on imported resources, particularly oil, made access to the Soviet Union's vast raw materials strategically enticing. Second, Hitler assumed that the Red Army, still reeling from Stalin's purges of the officer corps, would collapse quickly under the onslaught of the Wehrmacht. Finally, time seemed to favor a preemptive strike. Hitler feared that if left unchallenged, the Soviet Union would grow stronger and eventually pose a formidable threat. Thus, Operation Barbarossa was conceived not merely as a military gamble, but as the fulfillment of the Nazi ideological mission. The invasion of June 22, 1941, however, while ambitious in scope and initially devastating in execution, would prove fatally flawed. The sheer vastness of Soviet territory, the resilience of its people, the harshness of the Russian climate, and the limits of German resources combined to turn Hitler's dream of conquest into a nightmare. Far from securing Germany's dominance, Barbarossa opened the colossal Eastern Front, a battlefield that would consume the majority of German manpower and materiel until the Third Reich's collapse in 1945. Ultimately, Operation Barbarossa was not only the largest military invasion in history, but also the turning point that doomed Nazi Germany. It transformed the conflict into a total war of attrition that Germany could not win, ensuring that Hitler's ideological ambitions collapsed under the weight of their own overreach. The road to Barbarossa. Hitler's rise and obsession with the East. Adolf Hitler's rise to power in Germany was inseparably linked to his worldview, which placed the conquest of Eastern Europe at the center of his ambitions. From his early years in Vienna to the writing of Mein Kampf in the 1920s, Hitler consistently described the East as the future heartland of a German empire. Influenced by social Darwinist thought and pan-German nationalism, he believed that nations survived only by expanding their territory, securing food supplies, and subjugating weaker peoples. In Hitler's mind, Germany's destiny was to conquer the fertile lands of Eastern Europe and Russia, which he saw as underdeveloped and wasted by inferior Slavic populations. This obsession was not a passing idea, but a guiding principle. In Mein Kampf, Hitler explicitly declared that Germany should turn away from colonial ambitions overseas and instead pursue Lebensraum, living space, on the European continent, specifically in the East. The Soviet Union, governed by what he derided as Jewish Bolsheviks, became the ultimate target. Hitler believed that communism was not only politically hostile, but racially poisonous, and that destroying it would simultaneously eliminate Germany's greatest enemy and open up vast new territories for German settlement. By the time Hitler came to power in 1933, these ideas were already hardened into political doctrine. Nazi propaganda constantly reinforced the narrative of a Germany encircled and deprived of its rightful territory, while portraying Eastern Europe as both a racial threat and a land of opportunity. For Hitler, the destruction of the Soviet Union was not a secondary goal, but the raison d'etre of his regime. The path to war, therefore, was always heading eastward. The Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939, a temporary alliance. Despite Hitler's lifelong hatred of communism, circumstances forced him into a pragmatic arrangement with Joseph Stalin. In August 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union shocked the world by signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty that temporarily aligned two ideologically opposed states. The pact contained secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland would be partitioned, the Baltic states absorbed into Soviet control, and Germany given a free hand to launch its invasion of Poland without fear of Soviet interference. For Hitler, the pact was a means to an end. His immediate priority in 1939 was to neutralize Poland and prepare for war in the West. Avoiding a two-front conflict was essential, and the agreement with Stalin guaranteed German freedom of action. ... Meanwhile, the Soviet Union gained precious time to rebuild its armed forces, which had been weakened by Stalin's purges of the military leadership in the late 1930s. Nevertheless, the pact was never more than a temporary marriage of convenience. Both sides knew it was fragile. Nazi ideology remained uncompromising in its goal of destroying Bolshevism, while Soviet leaders viewed Germany's promises with deep suspicion. The uneasy alliance was further strained by disputes over spheres of influence in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. Stalin's annexations of the Baltic states, his war with Finland in 1939-40, and his interest in the Balkans made Hitler wary. By late 1940, Hitler had already begun to think about breaking the pact and fulfilling his ideological mission against the Soviet Union. Strategic victories in Western Europe, 1940-41. Before turning eastward, Hitler had to secure Germany's position in the West. The early campaigns of the war gave the Wehrmacht a reputation for invincibility. In September 1939, Poland fell in just over a month, divided between Germany and the Soviet Union. The following spring, German forces launched a series of stunning offensives. Denmark and Norway were conquered in April 1940, followed by the rapid collapse of France in June. The Blitzkrieg strategy, combining speed, surprise, and concentrated armored thrusts, allowed Germany to bypass the heavily fortified Maginot Line and defeat France in a matter of weeks. The victory over France was especially significant. It removed Germany's greatest continental rival and left Britain isolated. Hitler hoped Britain might sue for peace, but when this did not happen, he launched the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940. The Luftwaffe's failure to achieve air superiority prevented a German invasion, but Britain remained largely defensive and unable to threaten Germany directly. To Hitler, the stalemate in the West reinforced the argument that Germany's future lay in the East. Meanwhile, in the Balkans, Hitler secured his southern flank. In April 1941, Germany intervened in Yugoslavia and Greece, quickly defeating both. These campaigns, although successful, delayed the timetable for the planned invasion of the Soviet Union. Yet by the spring of 1941, Germany stood as the master of continental Europe. Its armies, battle-hardened and confident, planning and secret preparations. Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union crystallized in the latter half of 1940. In July, Only weeks after France's defeat, he first raised the idea with his generals. By December, Directive Number 21, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, was issued, setting out the framework for the invasion. The operation was named after Frederick Barbarossa, the medieval Holy Roman Emperor who had symbolized German expansionism in the East. Planning Barbarossa was an enormous undertaking. The German High Command envisioned a lightning campaign that would destroy the Red Army in a matter of months. The plan called for 3 massive army groups to strike deep into Soviet territory. Army Group North toward Leningrad, Army Group Center toward Moscow, and Army Group South toward Ukraine. The campaign was to be swift, with the expectation that the Soviet Union would collapse before winter. Secrecy was paramount. While Hitler maintained a public facade of cooperation with Stalin, behind the scenes, Germany was amassing resources, stockpiling supplies, and shifting divisions eastward. German intelligence, however, badly underestimated Soviet strength. Planners assumed the Red Army would crumble under the shock of Blitzkrieg. Much like Poland and France had, few in the German leadership grasped the vast scale of Soviet manpower reserves or the potential resilience of its industrial base. At the same time, ideological goals shaped military strategy. Barbarossa was not conceived as a conventional war, but as a war of annihilation. Plans such as the Commissar Order and the Hunger Plan outlined the systematic murder. Conclusion. By June 1941, Hitler had positioned Germany for what he believed would be his decisive triumph. The road to Barbarossa was paved by ideological obsession, temporary pragmatism in the Nazi-Soviet pact, dazzling victories in the West, and months of secret preparations. Yet beneath the confidence lay fatal flaws. Overconfidence in Blitzkrieg, underestimation of Soviet resilience, and the impossibility of waging a total war of annihilation across such vast territory. The stage was set for Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history, a campaign that would transform World War II and ultimately seal the fate of Nazi Germany. The German war machine. By the spring of 1941, Nazi Germany had assembled the largest and most formidable military force in Europe. The Wehrmacht, the armed forces of the Third Reich, had been forged through years of rearmament, training, and successful campaigns across the continent. Its victories over Poland, France, and the Low Countries had convinced both Germany and the wider world of its invincibility. Central to this perception was the doctrine of Blitzkrieg, lightning war, which emphasized speed, concentration of force, and the coordinated use of armor, infantry, and air power. As Hitler prepared to unleash Operation Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht stood at the peak of its strength, boasting hundreds of divisions, advanced weaponry, and a reputation for operational brilliance. Yet beneath this formidable appearance lay structural weaknesses in logistics, industry, and long-term sustainability that would prove decisive in the coming struggle against the Soviet Union. The Wehrmacht organization. The Wehrmacht, established in 1935 in defiance of the Versailles Treaty, consisted of three branches: the Heer, Army, the Luftwaffe, Air Force, and the Kriegsmarine, Navy. For the invasion of the Soviet Union, the focus overwhelmingly lay on the Heer and the Luftwaffe. The German Army, Heer, was the largest component, structured into field armies that were grouped under army groups. By June 1941, three massive army groups, North, Center, and South, were assembled along the Soviet frontier. Each army group was a vast organization, comprising infantry divisions, motorized units, and armored spearheads. Army Group Center, tasked with the drive toward Moscow, was the largest, fielding the bulk of Germany's armored strength. At the divisional level, the Wehrmacht was highly flexible. Infantry divisions formed the backbone, each consisting of about 15,000 men, organized into regiments, artillery, reconnaissance, and support units. Though fewer in number, played a disproportionately significant role, providing mobility and striking power. The Wehrmacht's command system emphasized initiative, with the doctrine of Auftragstaktik, mission command, allowing officers to adapt orders to battlefield realities. This flexibility was crucial in the fast-moving operations of Blitzkrieg. The Luftwaffe, under Hermann Göring, provided the air arm of the war machine. Its organization included fighter wings, Jagdgeschwader, bomber units, Kampfgeschwader, and specialized ground attack formations, such as those flying the Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber. Air fleets, Luftflotten, were assigned to support each army group, providing reconnaissance, close air support, and interdiction against enemy supply lines. The Luftwaffe's ability to dominate the skies had been decisive in earlier campaigns, and it was expected to play a similar role in Barbarossa. Blitzkrieg doctrine. The Wehrmacht's rapid successes between 1939 and 1941 were attributed to the doctrine of Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Although not a formally codified doctrine, Blitzkrieg described an operational style built on concentration of force, speed, and coordination. The idea was to achieve rapid breakthroughs at decisive points, encircle enemy forces, and destroy them before they could regroup. In practice, this meant concentrating armored divisions at narrow sectors of the front, punching through enemy lines, and exploiting the breach with mobile units. Motorized infantry followed to consolidate gains, while conventional infantry pressed forward to eliminate pockets of encircled troops. Artillery and air power played crucial supporting roles, suppressing enemy defenses and disrupting supply lines. The Luftwaffe was integral to Blitzkrieg. Stuka dive bombers targeted enemy. Communication between ground and air units allowed for coordinated strikes. Blitzkrieg aimed not at attrition, but at dislocation, paralyzing the enemy's command structure, sowing confusion, and forcing collapse through shock and speed. The success of Blitzkrieg in Poland and France created a sense of overconfidence, within the German leadership. Hitler and his generals came to believe that the Soviet Union, despite its size, would crumble just as quickly under the hammer blows of Blitzkrieg. This assumption would prove disastrously flawed. Armored divisions, Luftwaffe, and logistics. At the heart of the German war machine were its armored divisions, Panzer Division. By 1941, Germany fielded 17 Panzer divisions, each containing around 150 to 200 tanks, supported by mechanized infantry, artillery, engineers, and reconnaissance units. The Panzer divisions were not merely tank formations. They were combined arms forces designed for speed and independent action. German tanks at the outset of Barbarossa were not uniformly superior. The workhorses were the Panzer III and Panzer IV, medium tanks armed with 37mm or short 75mm guns. Many units still operated older Panzer I and II light tanks, which were underarmed and lightly armored. In sheer quality, these were inferior to the Soviet T-34 and KV-1 tanks that would soon confront them. However, German effectiveness lay in doctrine, organization, and communications. Unlike their Soviet counterparts, German tanks were equipped with radios, enabling coordination and tactical flexibility. Panzer divisions were highly mobile and could exploit breakthroughs with devastating effect. The Luftwaffe provided essential air superiority and close support. Aircraft such as the Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighter and the Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber were feared for their precision and effectiveness. German bombers, including the Heinkel He-111 and Junkers Ju-88, targeted rail networks, depots, and troop concentrations. At the start of Barbarossa, the Luftwaffe destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft on the ground, gaining temporary air supremacy. Yet beneath the striking power of the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe lay logistical weaknesses. German logistics were highly dependent on horse-drawn transport. Despite the mechanized image of Blitzkrieg, about 600,000 horses were used to pull wagons and artillery. Supply lines depended on trucks that were insufficient in number and prone to breakdown. The German rail network used a different gauge from Soviet railways. Once the invasion moved eastward, fuel shortages were a constant problem. Panzer divisions required enormous quantities of gasoline, which Germany struggled to produce or import in adequate amounts. These limitations, manageable in short campaigns, became crippling in the vast expanses of the Soviet Union. Strength of forces before the invasion. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa with the largest invasion force in history. Approximately 3.8 million German and Axis troops crossed into Soviet territory, supported by 600,000 vehicles, 600,000 horses, and nearly 4,000 tanks. The Luftwaffe committed around 2,700 aircraft, while the Navy played a minimal role, confined largely to the Baltic and Black Seas. The Wehrmacht fielded 153 divisions for the invasion, of which 19 were Panzer and 14 motorized. Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, aimed at Leningrad with 20 divisions and 800 tanks. Army Group Center, commanded by Fedor von Bock, was the strongest, with over 50 divisions and 1,700 tanks directed toward Moscow. Army Group South, under Gerd von Rundstedt, Axis allies, Romania, Hungary, and later Finland contributed additional forces, though often less well-equipped and trained. Romania provided oil resources crucial to the German war effort, while Finland sought to recover territories lost to the Soviet Union in the Winter War of 1939-40. On paper, the Wehrmacht appeared overwhelmingly powerful. Its troops were battle-hardened, its generals experienced, and its operational methods refined through years of victory. The German High Command expected the campaign to last no more than 3 to 6 months, with the Soviet Union collapsing under the shock of invasion. Yet, the very scale of the invasion revealed its risks. Germany was committing the bulk of its forces to a colossal front, stretching supply lines thin and relying on speed for success. Conclusion: the German war machine that launched Operation Barbarossa was the most formidable military instrument Europe had ever seen. The Wehrmacht's organization, Blitzkrieg doctrine, armored spearheads, and Luftwaffe support created an aura of invincibility that had swept aside every opponent thus far. But beneath this polished surface lay vulnerabilities in logistics, overconfidence in Blitzkrieg, and a dangerous underestimation of the Soviet Union's capacity for resistance. As the invasion began, in June 1941, Germany appeared poised for triumph, but the flaws of its war machine would soon be exposed in the vast, unforgiving expanses of Russia. The Soviet Union in 1941, on the eve of Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet Union stood as both a giant and a colossus with feet of clay. With vast resources, immense manpower, and strategic depth, it appeared formidable on paper. Yet beneath the surface, the Red Army was weakened by years of political purges, flawed leadership, and inadequate readiness. Joseph Stalin, though aware of the growing German threat, fatally underestimated both Hitler's intentions and the timing of an invasion. The paradox of 1941 was that the Soviet Union, though initially vulnerable, possessed the long-term strength to absorb Germany's blows and turn the tide of war. Stalin's purges and the weakened Red Army, perhaps the greatest weakness of the Soviet Union in 1941, stemmed from Stalin's own policies. Between 1937 and 1938, Stalin carried out massive purges of the Red Army, eliminating much of its professional officer corps. Estimates suggest that around 35,000 officers were dismissed, arrested, or executed, including 3 of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union and a majority of divisional commanders. This left the army riddled with inexperienced leaders, promoted for their loyalty rather than competence. The Winter War against Finland, 1939-40, exposed these weaknesses. Despite vast numerical superiority, the Red Army struggled against determined Finnish resistance, suffering heavy losses before eventually prevailing. The poor performance confirmed German assessments that the Soviet military was inept and fragile. Though reforms were underway by 1941, a modern, mechanized war, Soviet industry and population. Despite its military shortcomings, the Soviet Union's industrial and demographic resources were immense. With a population of roughly 190 million, it could field enormous armies and replace losses in manpower. The Soviet economy, guided by successive 5-year plans, had made dramatic strides in heavy industry. The USSR was one of the world's leading producers of tanks, aircraft, and artillery. By 1941, it had already deployed advanced weapons, such as the T-34 medium tank and the KV-1 heavy tank, both superior in armor and firepower to most German tanks. However, much of Soviet industry was concentrated in the western regions, vulnerable to German attack. Stalin's government had begun developing industrial bases east of the Urals, but these were not yet fully operational. The eventual evacuation and relocation of factories in 1941 to 42 would Soviet intelligence warnings ignored by Stalin. In the months before Barbarossa, Soviet intelligence gathered ample evidence of Germany's preparations. Soviet spies in Europe, including the famed Richard Sorge in Tokyo, repeatedly warned that an invasion was imminent. Reconnaissance along the border revealed massive German troop movements. Even Britain passed along intelligence reports of Hitler's intentions. Stalin, however, refused to believe the warnings, convinced that Hitler would not risk a two-front war while still fighting Britain. Stalin assumed that German troop movements were part of a bluff or intended to pressure Moscow into greater concessions. He feared provocation and forbade Soviet commanders from taking defensive measures that might antagonize Berlin. This paralysis left the Red Army dangerously exposed when the invasion began. Morale, readiness, and strategic depth. Soviet morale in 1941 was mixed. Stalin's repressive rule created fear and mistrust, while the trauma of the purges undermined confidence in leadership. Soldiers were poorly trained, supplies were often inadequate, and units along the western frontier were caught by surprise. When the invasion struck, entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed in the opening weeks. Yet, the Soviet Union's greatest asset lay in its strategic depth. Unlike smaller European states, it could retreat, trade space for time, and absorb catastrophic losses without collapse. The vastness of its territory, combined with its immense manpower and industrial potential, gave it resilience that Germany underestimated. Even as morale faltered in the summer of 1941, the brutality of the German conclusion. In 1941, the Soviet Union was simultaneously weak and strong. Stalin's purges and misjudgments left the Red Army vulnerable, while intelligence warnings went unheeded. Yet Soviet industry, manpower, and strategic depth provided the foundations for eventual recovery. Hitler believed the Soviet Union would collapse within weeks, but the very factors he dismissed, its vast resources and ability to endure, ensured that Barbarossa would become not a swift victory, but the beginning of Germany's downfall. The launch, June 22nd, 1941. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22nd, 1941, the silence of the eastern frontiers was shattered by the thunder of artillery and the roar of engines. In what became the largest military invasion in history, over 3 million German and Axis troops stormed across an 1,800-mile front, supported by thousands of tanks, guns, and aircraft. Operation Barbarossa had begun. The surprise was almost total. Despite weeks of intelligence warnings and troop buildups visible from the border, Joseph Stalin had refused to believe an attack was imminent. The result was devastating. The Red Army, poorly positioned and unprepared, was caught in the opening blow of a war that would decide the fate of Europe. A surprise attack at dawn. German planners had timed the invasion with meticulous precision. At dawn, artillery barrages rained down on Soviet positions, while searchlights swept the skies to blind defenders. Within minutes, German troops poured across bridges and fords, overwhelming border outposts. The Wehrmacht's armored spearheads spearheaded the assault, driving deep into Soviet territory before defenders could organize resistance. The attack struck the Soviet Union at a moment of complacency and confusion. Soviet frontier units were not fully mobilized. Aircraft were lined up in neat rows at airfields, and many commanders hesitated to act without orders from Moscow. Stalin, still clinging to the belief that Hitler would not break the Nazi-Soviet pact, initially assumed the invasion might be the result of rogue German commanders or a provocation by Britain. His hesitation in the three army groups. The German plan divided the invasion into 3 massive thrusts, each commanded by an army group. Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, attacked through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. With 20 divisions, including 4 panzer divisions, it aimed to capture the vital city and link up with Finnish forces advancing from the north. Army Group Center, the strongest formation under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, fielded over 50 divisions, including 9 panzer divisions, with more than 1,700 tanks. Its objective was the destruction of Soviet forces in Belarus and the capture of Moscow. 2 powerful panzer groups spearheaded the drive, executing vast encirclements of Soviet armies west of the capital. Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, was tasked with conquering Ukraine, the agricultural heartland of the Soviet Union. It deployed 57 divisions, supported by Romanian allies, and targeted the cities of Kiev and Kharkov before advancing toward the Caucasus oil fields. The scale of the operation was unprecedented. Never before had such a massive and coordinated force been unleashed. Each army group relied on fast-moving panzer divisions to penetrate Soviet lines, while infantry divisions followed to encircle and eliminate entire armies. Luftwaffe strikes, air supremacy from the start. Perhaps the most devastating blow on the opening day came from the Luftwaffe. In a carefully planned series of strikes, German bombers and fighters destroyed approximately 1,200 Soviet aircraft on the ground in the first 24 hours. Soviet air bases had been identified weeks earlier, and the attack was executed with ruthless efficiency. The Soviet Air Force, the VVS, was unprepared for the scale and precision of the assault. Aircraft were parked wingtip to wingtip, making them easy targets. Communication failures and Stalin's reluctance to put forces on alert left pilots unable to respond. Within days, the Luftwaffe had destroyed over 4,000 Soviet aircraft, establishing near-total air supremacy. This allowed German ground forces to advance with minimal fear of aerial attack, while Stuka dive bombers devastated Soviet columns, supply depots, and bridges. Rapid advances and early encirclements. The opening weeks of Barbarossa produced some of the most dramatic advances in military history. German panzer groups surged forward, bypassing strong points and racing deep into Soviet territory. Infantry divisions sealed off the flanks, creating massive pockets that trapped entire Soviet armies. The first major encirclement occurred at Minsk. By July 9th, just over 2 weeks after the invasion, Army Group Center had surrounded and destroyed 4 Soviet armies, capturing over 300,000 men and thousands of tanks and guns. The road to Moscow appeared open. The momentum continued at Smolensk, where another encirclement in July-August trapped over 180,000 Soviet troops. The battles were brutal, but German victories seemed unstoppable. Each success reinforced Hitler's belief that the Soviet Union was collapsing, just as Poland and France had before it. Further south, Kiev became the site of perhaps the largest encirclement in military history. In September 1941, a vast German pincer movement trapped over 600,000 Soviet troops, annihilating much of the Red Army's southwestern front. Prisoners were marched west in columns that stretched for miles, while German propaganda proclaimed the Soviet Union finished. Blitzkrieg triumphs and early problems. The opening phase of Barbarossa was a triumph of Blitzkrieg on an unprecedented scale. German forces advanced hundreds of miles in weeks, destroying Soviet armies and capturing vast territories. By the autumn of 1941, millions of Soviet soldiers were dead, wounded, or prisoners. German commanders boasted that victory was near, and Hitler declared that the Soviet Union was a colossus with feet of clay. Yet beneath the triumphs, problems were already emerging. The sheer size of the Soviet Union stretched German logistics to the breaking point. Supply lines lengthened across poor roads, with horse-drawn wagons carrying much of the burden. Fuel shortages became acute as panzer divisions outran their supply convoys. The Luftwaffe, though dominant, suffered attrition and faced the vast distances of the Russian steppe. Most importantly, the Red Army, though repeatedly smashed, refused to collapse. New formations were raised, reserves were thrown into battle, and Soviet factories continued to produce tanks and planes. The Soviet people, shocked by the brutality of the invasion and the genocidal policies of the occupiers, began to rally for a war of national survival. What had seemed in June like a short campaign was already beginning to transform into a struggle of attrition. Conclusion: the launch of Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, was a military earthquake. The Wehrmacht struck with unprecedented power, overwhelming Soviet defenses, destroying thousands of planes, and capturing entire armies in colossal encirclements. The first weeks brought triumphs that dazzled the world and seemed to confirm Hitler's vision of a lightning victory. Yet, beneath the victories lay the seeds of failure. Logistics faltered, Soviet resilience stiffened, and the vastness of Russia stretched German power thin. What began as the most ambitious military offensive in history would soon become the decisive struggle that determined the fate of the Third Reich. Operational successes: millions of Soviet POWs. The opening phase of Barbarossa produced a staggering harvest of prisoners. By early July, Army Group Center had enveloped Soviet forces around Minsk, capturing over 300,000 men. A few weeks later, at Smolensk, another 180,000 fell into German hands. These encirclements destroyed entire Soviet armies, depriving the Red Army of experienced troops and officers. German propaganda trumpeted these victories as proof that the Soviet Union was collapsing. Army Group North advanced steadily through the Baltic states toward Leningrad, while Army Group South crushed Soviet defenses in Ukraine. The most spectacular success came in September at Kiev, where a massive pincer movement by Army Group Center and South trapped over 600,000 Soviet troops, the largest encirclement in military history. By the end of 1941, Germany had captured to German commanders. This seemed to confirm their pre-war assumptions that a few decisive battles would eliminate the Soviet Union as a military power. The speed and scale of these victories stunned both friend and foe. Never before had armies of such size been annihilated so quickly. For the Soviet leadership and people, the shock was profound. Divisions vanished from the order of battle overnight. and the German advance appeared unstoppable. The Wehrmacht seemed poised to achieve Hitler's goal of destroying the Soviet state in a single campaign. Battles of encirclement and psychological shock. German operational methods emphasized mobility, coordination, and encirclement. Armored spearheads punched through weak points, racing deep into Soviet rear areas, while infantry followed to close the pockets. The result was the capture of vast numbers of Soviet soldiers, who often fought bravely, but were outmaneuvered and cut off from supplies. The psychological effect of these battles was enormous. German troops, hardened by earlier victories in Poland and France, marveled at the scale of Soviet collapses. Many believed the war was effectively won by autumn. For the Soviet population, the initial months brought devastation and despair. Cities fell, farms and villages were destroyed, and millions were displaced. The Red Army's reputation, already damaged by the Winter War against Finland, seemed to be confirmed as incompetent and doomed. Yet the same brutality that accompanied the invasion, mass executions, starvation policies, and the persecution of Jews and civilians hardened Soviet resistance. What began as demoralization gradually turned into determination, as the war became not only a struggle for survival, but also a fight for the homeland against a genocidal occupier. Early Soviet counterattacks. Despite catastrophic losses, the Soviet Union did not collapse. Stalin, after recovering from the initial shock, rallied his people with appeals to patriotism and ruthless measures to enforce discipline. New armies were hastily raised, often composed of poorly trained recruits, but their sheer numbers slowed German momentum. Throughout July and August, Soviet forces launched desperate counterattacks. At Smolensk, Red Army units counterattacked repeatedly, delaying the German advance on Moscow. Though costly in casualties, these actions bought time for reinforcements to arrive and for industry to be relocated east of the Urals. Similar counterattacks occurred in Ukraine, where Soviet forces tried to stem the German tide around Kiev. While most of these offensives ended in failure, they demonstrated the Red Army's resilience. By the autumn of 1941, Soviet commanders were learning from their mistakes. They began deploying defense-in-depth tactics, trading space for time, and relying on the vastness of their territory to wear down the enemy. The myth of German invincibility, though still potent, was beginning to crack at the edges. German logistical strains. For all their battlefield brilliance, the Germans were increasingly constrained by logistics. Barbarossa had been designed as a lightning campaign, lasting a few months at most. When victory did not come quickly, the limitations of the German supply system became glaring. The vast distances of the Soviet Union dwarfed anything Germany had faced in Western Europe. As panzer divisions raced ahead, their supply lines lagged behind, dependent on horse-drawn wagons and a limited number of trucks. Fuel shortages became chronic, forcing armored units to halt while waiting for resupply. Ammunition and spare parts were often scarce, and broken-down vehicles littered the roadsides. Railways, crucial for supplying large armies, presented an even greater challenge. The Soviet Union used a different track gauge from Western Europe, meaning that German forces had to convert captured lines before trains could run. This process was slow and labor-intensive, delaying supplies to the front. As a result, troops often went hungry, fuel ran dry, and artillery lacked shells. The Luftwaffe, though initially dominant, also faced strains. Aircraft wore out quickly in the harsh conditions, while losses mounted from continuous operations. The sheer distances of the Soviet theater stretched its ability to provide close support, and the number of available aircraft began to dwindle. Stretched supply lines and the problem of time. By the autumn of 1941, the initial momentum of Barbarossa had slowed. The encirclement battles had destroyed huge Soviet forces, but new armies kept appearing. The Wehrmacht, though still advancing, was exhausted. Supply shortages slowed operations, and casualties were mounting. German commanders faced a cruel dilemma: push forward with depleted forces, or pause and risk giving the Soviets time to recover. Hitler's strategic decisions compounded the problem. In August, he diverted Army Group Center's Panzer Division south to help encircle Kiev, delaying the drive on Moscow. While the Kiev victory was spectacular, it cost precious weeks. By the time the Germans resumed their push toward Moscow in October, autumn rains had turned roads into seas of mud, and winter was approaching. The Blitzkrieg timetable, predicated on a swift victory, was unraveling. Toward Moscow, Operation Typhoon. By early autumn 1941, after months of spectacular advances, Hitler believed the decisive blow against the Soviet Union was finally within reach. The summer campaign had brought enormous German victories. Vast swathes of territory seized, millions of Soviet prisoners taken, and the Red Army seemingly broken again and again. Yet the Soviet Union refused to collapse. With the onset of October, the German High Command launched Operation Typhoon, the long-anticipated drive on Moscow. The plan envisioned a knockout strike, encircling the Soviet capital and forcing Stalin's regime to capitulate. The battles of Smolensk, Vyazma, and Bryansk opened the campaign, pushing Soviet defenses to the brink and throwing Moscow into panic. But disagreements within the German leadership and the growing strain of prolonged war foreshadowed the failure to come. Smolensk, Vyazma, and Bryansk battles. First phase of Operation Typhoon unfolded with devastating speed. At Smolensk, earlier in the summer, German forces had already battered Soviet defenses, but by October, they renewed their assault with fresh determination. Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, spearheaded the offensive with two panzer groups, Hoth's Panzer Group 3 to the north and Guderian's Panzer Group 2 to the south, supported by massive infantry formations. The Soviets, commanded by General Georgy Zhukov and others, attempted to establish defensive lines west of Moscow, but German armored thrusts quickly broke through. In the Vyazma encirclement to the northwest of Moscow, Guderian and Hoth's forces linked up trapping 4 Soviet armies. Simultaneously, to the south near Bryansk, another vast encirclement formed, capturing hundreds of thousands of Red Army troops. The scale of the disaster was staggering. By mid-October, over 650,000 Soviet soldiers reported killed or captured. Entire divisions vanished, leaving only scattered survivors to fall back toward the capital. These defeats seemed to confirm German confidence that the Red Army's backbone was broken. Near collapse of Soviet defense, the fall of Vyazma and Bryansk left Moscow virtually exposed. German tanks now stood within 200 kilometers of the city. Rail and road connections were shattered. Soviet reserves were depleted, and panic spread through both the army and the population. The destruction of so many Soviet armies in such a short span led many in Berlin to believe that the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. Inside Moscow, the government began preparations for evacuation. Critical industries and administrative offices were moved eastward. Ordinary citizens, sensing disaster, dug trenches and barricades, while rumors of German entry into the city spread daily. For the first time since Napoleon's 1812 invasion, Moscow appeared to face imminent capture. Yet even in crisis, the Soviet regime refused to surrender. Stalin made the fateful decision to remain in Moscow rather than flee. His presence and his speeches calling for resistance stiffened morale at a moment when the state seemed ready to disintegrate. Reinforcements were rushed from the east, including divisions transferred from Siberia, where Soviet intelligence had confirmed that Japan would not attack. Hitler versus generals. Strategic disagreements. The road to Moscow was not simply a military campaign, but also a clash of strategic visions within the German leadership. Hitler believed the Soviet Union's collapse would come only with the capture of its political and symbolic heart, Moscow. His generals, however, were divided. Some, like Franz Halder and Fedor von Bock, supported the thrust toward the capital, arguing that seizing Moscow would cripple Soviet communications, rail networks, and morale. Others believed resources should be concentrated in the south, where Ukraine's agricultural and industrial wealth could secure long-term German war aims. Earlier in August, Hitler had diverted Guderian's panzer group southward to assist in the encirclement at Kiev, a decision that delayed the advance on Moscow by weeks. The Kiev victory yielded another massive bag of Soviet prisoners, but consumed precious time. By the time the offensive reached the outskirts of Moscow, rains and the first snows had begun, turning roads into impassable mud and threatening the entire operation. These delays illustrated a recurring flaw in German strategy: Hitler's obsession with multiple objectives and his distrust of professional military advice. While generals argued for concentration, Hitler demanded simultaneous conquests, Leningrad in the north, Ukraine in the south, and Moscow in the center, stretching German resources to the breaking point. Moscow in panic. By October 1941, Moscow teetered on the edge of collapse. The city endured air raids, shortages, and an influx of refugees from the front. German reconnaissance aircraft flew over the Kremlin itself, underscoring the immediacy of the threat. On October 16th, with news of the Vyazma encirclement, panic erupted. Crowds stormed railway stations, looting broke out, and rumors of German paratroopers in the city caused chaos. Some Soviet officials fled eastward in anticipation of defeat. But the panic subsided almost as quickly as it arose. Stalin's decision to remain in Moscow and deliver a defiant speech on November 7th, the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, rallied both troops and civilians. The mobilization of workers, the arrival of reinforcements, and the sheer determination of the population transformed the defense of Moscow into a symbol of Soviet endurance. Conclusion: Operation Typhoon brought Germany closer to victory than at any other moment on the Eastern Front. The destruction of Soviet armies at Vyazma and Bryansk appeared to open the gates to Moscow, while the Soviet regime teetered on the edge of collapse. Yet delays, logistical exhaustion, and Hitler's conflicting strategic goals weakened the German effort. As Moscow braced for siege, the battle was far from over. The coming winter and the Soviet counteroffensive would turn the tide, transforming what Hitler envisioned as a decisive triumph into the first great failure of Barbarossa. Soviet resilience. By late 1941, the initial shock of Barbarossa had worn off, and the Soviet Union began to demonstrate a resilience that would ultimately frustrate the German war machine. Despite staggering losses, the Soviet state mobilized its population, industry, and military resources with extraordinary determination. From the relocation of critical factories to the Urals, to the mobilization of society and harsh discipline on the front lines, the USSR displayed an adaptability and tenacity that caught the Wehrmacht by surprise. Even as German troops advanced deep into Soviet territory, partisan activity in the rear disrupted supply lines and communication, highlighting that the Soviet Union, though battered, remained far from defeated. Relocation of industry to the Urals. One of the most remarkable feats of Soviet resilience was the massive relocation of industry east of the Ural Mountains, beyond the reach of German forces. In the summer and autumn of 1941, as the Wehrmacht approached Moscow and Leningrad, the Soviet government orchestrated an unprecedented transfer of factories, machinery, and personnel. Entire plants producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery were dismantled, loaded onto thousands of trains, and rebuilt hundreds of kilometers east. This operation required extraordinary organization. Workers dismantled equipment, packed it into railway cars, and reassembled it under extreme conditions. The harsh Russian winter, combined with the threat of air raids, and the immense distances involved made the task almost unimaginable. Yet, within months, the relocated factories began producing essential war materiel, including T-34 tanks, KV-1. The front lines. The Soviet Union ensured that Germany's rapid advances would not translate into long-term strategic victory. Mobilization of the Red Army and society. The Red Army, though shattered in the opening months of Barbarossa, was rapidly rebuilt. Millions of men were conscripted, including young soldiers, older men, and even factory workers with minimal training. Special emphasis was placed on creating new divisions and reinforcing depleted units. Women, too, were mobilized to serve as nurses, clerks, and even combatants in air defense and anti-tank units. Soviet society as a whole was harnessed for the war effort. Civilian labor was redirected toward the production of weapons, ammunition, and infrastructure repair. Schools, universities, and factories became training grounds for soldiers and technicians. The population endured shortages and hardship with remarkable fortitude, motivated both by patriotism and the existential threat posed by Nazi occupation. This total mobilization transformed the Soviet Union into a war economy capable of sustaining prolonged conflict. Harsh discipline. Stalin's not a step back orders. To maintain cohesion and prevent retreat under pressure, Stalin issued Order Number 227 on July 28, 1942, famously declaring, "Not a step back." While this directive postdates the first winter of the war, its principles were already applied in late 1941, emphasizing discipline and the use of blocking detachments to prevent desertion or unauthorized withdrawal. Commanders were given authority to execute or punish soldiers who retreated without orders, ensuring that frontline units held positions even under extreme stress. This harsh approach was controversial, but it reinforced Soviet resolve. While morale was fragile after massive defeats at Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev, the combination of political oversight, severe discipline, and appeals to patriotic duty kept armies in the field. Soldiers fought, knowing that retreat was not an option, and in many cases, the threat of punishment strengthened collective cohesion. Soviet partisan warfare. Even as the Wehrmacht advanced deep into Soviet territory, resistance did not disappear behind the lines. Soviet partisans, civilians, escaped soldiers, and irregular units began conducting guerrilla operations aimed at disrupting German supply lines, communications, and railways. Partisan attacks, while not decisive in themselves, imposed constant logistical challenges on the Germans. Trains were derailed, bridges blown up, and supply depots raided, forcing the Wehrmacht to divert troops to rear area security. The psychological effect of partisan warfare was also significant. German soldiers, often already exhausted by rapid advances and harsh conditions, faced constant ambushes, sabotage, and attacks from a population they had expected to control easily. This persistent resistance undermined morale and contributed to the growing difficulties of sustaining the Blitzkrieg across the vast Soviet expanse. The winter of 1941 to 42 By November 1941, German forces had reached the outskirts of Moscow, advancing hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory in what had seemed like an unstoppable campaign. Panzer divisions had encircled and destroyed Soviet armies at Vyazma and Bryansk. Millions of soldiers had been captured, and the Wehrmacht appeared poised to deliver the decisive blow against the Soviet Union. Yet the rapid advance, coupled with overstretched supply lines, would soon collide with one of history's harshest winters. The winter of 1941 to 42 exposed the limits of German planning and preparedness, and marked the first major reversal for Hitler's forces in World War II. German troops unprepared for winter. The Wehrmacht had been designed for rapid, mobile warfare in the summer months. Its clothing, vehicles, and equipment were optimized for speed and maneuver, not for enduring extreme cold. By late November, temperatures across the central Russian front fell well below freezing, often reaching 20 degrees Celsius or -4 Fahrenheit or lower. German soldiers, many of them lacking proper winter gear, suffered frostbite, hypothermia, and illness in alarming numbers. Armored vehicles, trucks, and artillery, vital to the Blitzkrieg strategy, were not winterized. Lubricants froze, engines failed, and tanks became immobilized in mud or snow. Horses, heavily relied upon for transport, often froze to death or starved. Even simple maintenance became a daily struggle in the bitter cold, reducing operational capacity. For troops who had marched hundreds of kilometers with minimal rest, the freezing, lack of supplies, and morale issues compounding the harsh climate were acute supply shortages. The German logistical system, already strained by the distances of the Eastern Front, could not keep pace with the advancing armies. Fuel, food, winter clothing, and ammunition became scarce. Supply convoys, delayed by poor roads, snow, and partisan attacks, often failed to reach frontline units. Soldiers scavenged what they could from abandoned Soviet towns. But these efforts were insufficient for sustained operations. Morale deteriorated rapidly. Troops who had celebrated encirclement victories in summer now faced endless cold, exhaustion, and hunger. Letters from home were delayed or lost, and reports of Soviet resilience and reinforcement undermined confidence. For many soldiers, the initial belief in a quick victory was replaced by fear, fatigue, and frustration. Come the Soviet counteroffensive at Moscow. Sensing the overextension of German forces and inspired by Stalin's calls for resistance, the Red Army launched a counteroffensive on December 5th, 1941. Siberian divisions, previously stationed in the Far East and familiar with winter warfare, were rushed to the front. Fresh, well-equipped troops, hardened by the severe climate, faced exhausted German units. A Soviet counteroffensive exploited the Wehrmacht's vulnerabilities. Freezing conditions immobilized tanks, slowed infantry, and disrupted supply lines. Artillery and aircraft, previously dominant, were less effective under snow and ice. Soviet forces launched coordinated attacks on the flanks of German positions, gradually pushing the invaders back. Villages, roads, and rail lines became battlefields as both sides struggled to operate in the extreme cold. The counteroffensive caught German commanders by surprise. Hitler, convinced of imminent victory, had underestimated Soviet resilience and overestimated the ability of his troops to sustain combat in winter. German units, already depleted from months of fighting, were forced onto the defensive for the first time. Retreats, though initially unplanned, became necessary to avoid encirclement and annihilation. First major German defeat in World War II. The winter counteroffensive marked the first major defeat for the German army in World War II. Soviet forces regained territory around Moscow, pushing German troops back from the gates of the capital by 100 to 250 kilometers. Encirclement attempts failed, and German plans for a rapid conquest of the Soviet Union collapsed. The psychological impact was profound. The Wehrmacht, previously seen as invincible, had been stopped in its tracks. For the Soviets, the success boosted morale and validated Stalin's strategy of resilience, total mobilization, and strategic depth. Civilians and soldiers alike were emboldened by the knowledge that the seemingly unstoppable German war machine could be resisted and defeated. For Hitler, the failure shattered the myth of Blitzkrieg invincibility and forced a reassessment of the Eastern Front's challenges, though he would continue to pursue ambitious offensives in subsequent years. Hitler's strategic mistakes. Operation Barbarossa initially seemed unstoppable, yet underlying strategic miscalculations would ultimately doom Hitler's campaign against the Soviet Union. Central among these errors was the underestimation of Soviet manpower and industrial capacity. German intelligence assumed that millions of Soviet soldiers could not be replaced, and that the USSR's industrial base, largely located in vulnerable Western regions, would collapse under swift occupation. In reality, the Soviet Union possessed enormous reserves of men and material. Factories were relocated east of the Urals, and new armies were rapidly raised, ensuring that each tactical German victory could be countered with fresh Soviet forces. Hitler also delayed the advance on Moscow in favor of secondary objectives, including the encirclement of Kiev and the push toward Leningrad. While these operations produced stunning battlefield victories and millions of prisoners, they consumed critical time and resources, pushing the German offensive into the harsh Russian winter. The delay allowed the Red Army to regroup, reinforce the capital, and prepare for the counteroffensive that would blunt the Wehrmacht's momentum. Compounding these errors was Hitler's ideological approach. Barbarossa was conceived not merely as a military campaign, but as a war of extermination intended to destroy Bolshevism and subjugate Slavic populations. Brutal occupation policies alienated local populations, fostering resistance and partisan warfare that disrupted German supply lines and diverted forces from the front. Finally, Hitler ignored logistical realities. Blitzkrieg relied on rapid advances supported by well-supplied mechanized units, yet German supply chains were overstretched across vast distances, inadequate for sustained combat in the Russian winter, and vulnerable to partisan sabotage. Trucks, horses, and rail lines could not keep pace with advancing divisions, leaving soldiers underfed, underarmed, and unprepared for harsh conditions. Collectively, these strategic miscalculations transformed what was meant to be a swift, decisive campaign into a prolonged war of attrition, in which German tactical brilliance was repeatedly undermined by operational and ideological errors. The human cost. The invasion of the Soviet Union exacted an unprecedented toll on human life. Beyond the strategic and military dimensions of Barbarossa, the war on the Eastern Front was marked by systematic atrocities, genocidal policies, and widespread civilian suffering. Hitler's ideological vision of Lebensraum and racial war fueled a campaign of terror that left millions dead and traumatized survivors on both sides. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile SS death squads, followed the Wehrmacht's advance, carrying out mass executions of Jews, political commissars, and other undesirable groups. Entire communities were annihilated in towns and villages across the occupied territories. The Holocaust, already underway in Germany, expanded dramatically in the East, where ghettos, mass shootings, and forced labor became daily realities for civilian populations. The Nazi occupation deliberately targeted not only perceived enemies of the Reich, but also those who resisted or failed to cooperate, creating an atmosphere of constant fear. Civilians endured extraordinary suffering. Cities and towns were destroyed during the fighting. Food and medical supplies were scarce, leading to starvation and disease. Millions were deported to labor camps, and entire regions were depopulated as part of the German scorched earth policies. Families were torn apart, communities decimated, and the social fabric of vast territories was shattered. The human cost on the battlefield was equally staggering. Soviet and German armies suffered enormous casualties in encirclement battles, frontal assaults, and winter campaigns. Millions of soldiers died, while many more were wounded or captured under harsh conditions. The psychological impact of constant violence, witnessing atrocities, and enduring extreme hardship affected combatants and civilians alike, leaving deep scars on morale, mental health, and society. The brutality of the Eastern Front also had long-term implications. For the Soviets, the horrors of occupation galvanized resistance, contributing to the mobilization of society, partisan warfare, and a determination to defeat the invader at any cost. For German soldiers, exposure to ideological extermination policies often hardened attitudes, eroded moral restraint, and created psychological burdens that would linger long after the war. The human cost of Barbarossa was thus enormous, measured not only in lives lost, but also in suffering endured and societies traumatized. It was a war in which strategy, ideology, and cruelty converged, producing some of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. Long-term consequences. Operation Barbarossa was more than a massive military campaign. It became the turning point of World War II, shaping the conflict's strategic, political, and global trajectory. While the invasion initially delivered stunning German victories, the campaign ultimately exposed critical flaws in Hitler's planning and marked the beginning of the Wehrmacht's long-term decline on the Eastern Front. The failure to decisively defeat the Soviet Union ensured that Germany would face a prolonged attritional war. The Wehrmacht, though still tactically skilled, was stretched across vast distances, overextended, and weakened by heavy casualties and logistical strains. Battles such as Moscow and later Stalingrad demonstrated that German forces could be halted and ultimately defeated. The Eastern Front would consume enormous German resources for the remainder of the war, leaving insufficient forces to secure victories in other theaters. Barbarossa's failure also strengthened the Allied coalition by committing Germany to a war of attrition in the East. The campaign tied down divisions that might otherwise have been deployed against Britain or in North Africa. The Soviet Union, bolstered by industrial relocation, mobilization, and external aid, such as Lend-Lease from the United States, endured and eventually pushed back German advances. The ability of the USSR to survive and recover encouraged greater Allied cooperation, as Britain and the United States recognized the Soviet Union as an indispensable partner in defeating Nazi Germany. For Germany, the consequences were profound. The army never fully recovered from the immense casualties and material losses incurred during Barbarossa. Even after temporary successes in 1942, the Wehrmacht struggled to replace men, tanks, aircraft, and artillery at the pace required by sustained operations on the Eastern Front. German strategic flexibility was increasingly constrained, leaving Hitler's forces vulnerable to Soviet offensives. Conversely, the campaign accelerated the rise of the Soviet Union as a superpower, surviving the onslaught, mobilizing society, and eventually turning the tide of the war, enhanced the USSR's military reputation, expanded its influence in Eastern Europe, and solidified its status as a global power. The experience of Barbarossa reinforced the importance of strategic depth, industrial capacity, and total mobilization, lessons that would define Soviet military doctrine and political strategy for decades to come. In retrospect, Operation Barbarossa transformed World War II. It shifted the balance of power in Europe, revealed the limits of German military might and set the stage for the Soviet Union's emergence as a dominant post-war actor. Hitler's failure in the East proved decisive, not only for the outcome of the war, but for the geopolitical order that would follow. Conclusion: Operation Barbarossa was conceived as the culmination of Hitler's ideological vision, the conquest of Lebensraum in the East, the destruction of Soviet communism, and the subjugation of peoples deemed racially inferior. Launched in June 1941 with unprecedented force, it represented the largest invasion in history and initially achieved remarkable success through Blitzkrieg tactics, rapid advances, and massive encirclements. Yet beneath the surface of these victories lay the seeds of failure, logistical overstretch, strategic indecision, and the underestimation of Soviet resilience gradually undermined the German war effort. The campaign exposed the contradictions between Hitler's ambitions and military realities. His diversion of forces toward Ukraine and Leningrad delayed the decisive thrust at Moscow, while the ideological war of extermination alienated potential allies among local populations. Meanwhile, Stalin's Soviet Union, despite early disasters, demonstrated extraordinary resilience, relocating industry, mobilizing manpower, and enforcing strict discipline. By the winter of 1941-42, the Red Army had not only survived, but counterattacked before Moscow, inflicting on Germany its first major defeat of the war. In military history, Barbarossa stands as a case study in the dangers of overambition and flawed strategic planning. It revealed that even the most powerful war machine of its time could falter when confronted by vast geography, unyielding resistance, and the logistical limits of modern warfare. The operation also transformed the Second World War into a truly global conflict of attrition, draining German strength and shifting the strategic balance irreversibly. Ultimately, Barbarossa determined the outcome of World War II. By failing to crush the Soviet Union, Germany condemned itself to a two-front war it could not win. The Eastern Front became the decisive theater where Nazi Germany bled to death, while the Soviet Union emerged as a superpower, shaping the post-war world.